Welcome to the Tracking Connections podcast, and thanks for listening.
We feature voices from around the world sharing stories of working intentionally with deep nature connection in ways that transform lives, families, projects, and communities. I'm Sarah.
I'm Aidan.
And I'm Jon.
And we are your hosts from Living Connection First. Well, hello, everybody. This is Aidan, and I'm here with Jon. And I'm excited to introduce you to Kathleen Lockyer. She's an occupational therapist, award-winning author, and speaker. She's the daughter of a fisherman from Newfoundland, Canada, and a debutant from New York City. Raised a little wild and a little cultured, she's learned enough to know that preserving a healthy amount of wild is good for a growing heart, body, and mind. Her joy is guiding others to reclaim wholeness and love the messiness of raising children while healing themselves. Hi, Kathleen. How you doing?
Hey, Aidan. I'm good. How are you today?
Doing great. Really glad to be here with you.
Yeah, well, I'm here too, you two, so don't leave me out.
Hi. Hi.
Good to see you too, Jon.
Well, it's really fun to have you on here, Kathleen. Kathleen and I, we go back a ways, and maybe you remember what year, Kathleen, because I have a hard time remembering, but I think it was a few years ago.
2003, I believe.
Yeah.
First year I moved out to California.
And we've been on a journey. I mean, Kathleen and I have taught together and worked together in a lot of places over the years. And I've always really loved Kathleen's, I don't even want to call it work, because I don't think Kathleen thinks that this is work. Her commitment to her path, really, and the way she helps people. And you've helped so many. I know you've trained so many people. But tell us a little bit about you and, how you came to blend deep nature connection and occupational therapy, especially that story of what Kathleen said to me one day that made my hair stand up. You can't rehabilitate something that hasn't been habilitated in the first place.
Yeah, so a little bit about me, and I'll try to tie this in with meeting you as well, because that was a pinnacle moment for my life, as it has been for many people, I'm sure. The story you're talking about happened when I was in college. I went to college kind of late. And I hadn't known what I wanted to do in my life. And I'd had probably dozens and dozens of jobs between the time I was 11, when I started babysitting my younger brother and another toddler every summer. And at the time, I think I was 21 when I heard about occupational therapy. And I was in the backseat of a car on the way home from a snowboarding trip, back when, you remember when snowboarding was kind of illegal on most mountains. So I was sitting next to a guy I had just met, and he said to me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I do a lot of things." And then I switched the subject and said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm an occupational therapist." And I said, "What's that?" And he started telling me about his specialty of working with hands. And at that moment, I kind of started reeling in my mind, thinking about hands and how much of my childhood I had spent kind of observing hands and what hands did and how they responded and reacted to the world. And because my father, being a fisherman from Newfoundland, had these massive hands. Like, we used to joke that his thumbs were like big toes. They were so thick. And so I was just thinking about his hands and thinking about this fella who that was primarily his work, dedicated to working with people in their hands when they'd been injured and helping rehabilitate them. So I went home and I immediately went to the library, researched occupational therapy, filled out one application, sent it to one college, and waited for the rejection letter because my high school transcript was pretty sad. And occupational therapy was really a really hard field to get into. And by some miracle or accident, I got in. So I found myself about a year later in a class called Abnormal Psychology. And in that class, the teacher one day had been talking about mental health issues and bipolar disorder and anxiety, depression, rage, all these things that, to be honest, I hadn't really thought much about that. This was 1990 or something, 91. Back then, mental health wasn't talked about very much. But as the class was moving forward in that day, the professor posed a question to the class, and he said, "Give me some ideas on how to rehabilitate incarcerated people who are in jail for hard crime, and what are some things that we can do?" Because occupational therapists, we help people with occupation or activities of daily living to help them rehabilitate, to bring them meaning in life and to help them re-engage with life and so many other things. So the class was, popcorning all these answers. We can help them find jobs, help them find housing, help them do this. And in my mind, I was kind of down that spiral that I was in that backseat of the car that other day, thinking about hands. And I was having all these memories of the way my father actually behaved in the world. And I had this one memory come back right in the middle of class where my dad, I was about 8 or 9 years old, and our car slammed to a stop. And the next thing I knew, I'm witnessing this man in front of us pulling this driver out his window and slamming him against the side of the car. And all of a sudden, my mom in the front seat screams, "Rock!" And it wasn't till that moment that I realized that the man that had pulled the other man out was my father.
Mm.
So I'm having this memory in this class this day. And all of a sudden, I just kind of blurted out, "Wait." And everyone looked at me, and I said, because I was thinking about something my father had said growing up, how he joked. "Geez, bye," he'd say. He'd say, "I don't know how I didn't ever end up in jail. All the guys I knew are either in jail or dead."
Hmm.
And that's when I realized he's never even been habilitated. That's when I blurted out, we're talking about rehabilitating an entire population of people who've never even been habilitated in the first place. And it was really that moment that turned my behavior around too, because I hadn't even known that my behavior was unskillful or that I didn't know how to communicate effectively, and I had struggled with that. So it was that point in my life that I started really looking at all those pieces and how to actually habilitate a person and what that takes. And it was also around that time where I lived in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I was spending a lot of time out at Quabbin Reservoir by myself and thinking about nature and how nature had supported me my whole life, no matter where we moved, what country we were living in, what town we were living in, who was in our lives or wasn't in our lives. Nature was the one constant in my life. And I knew that had so much to do with the reason I was so okay at that point. And the fact that I was able to not only get myself into college, but be supporting myself and putting myself through college. So that was around 1995. I graduated in 96. And by 1997, I had a daughter. It all happened very quickly. And that really speeds things up, right? When we have children, it kind of brings us back to all of those pieces that we realize, I just want to do it better. I want to do it right. I want my child to have ease. I want to raise a good person. And how do you do that? And so that kind of sped up my research into looking at all those pieces. And a couple years after she was born, actually several years after she was born, she was 5, and I had another daughter who was 2. We moved to California because their father was from California and he didn't love the East Coast. We were in Connecticut at the time. And so it was that first year I met you, Jon. I had heard about some workshop in the middle of nowhere doing some random thing. And I didn't know even what you were doing. I had never heard of you. And I just knew in my heart that it was something I was supposed to be at. So I went and I met you, and I believe Paul Rayfield was there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Sharon was there and Mark. And so I had my whole family there. And Jon, every lecture you spoke, I just felt like, I was looking around the room thinking, what am I missing? And then somebody had said to me at one of the breaks, what do you think? How do you think this is going? And I'm like, in my mind, I started calling it, egotistically, I started calling it the duh factor because everything just resonated so obviously to me with what you were saying about nature connection. And you talked about some sensory things. And, that's my area of specialty is sensory processing and integration. And what that did, those lectures and all the things you introduced to my life in that moment, including bird language, and it really brought all those pieces of nature connection, all the times I'd been outside, all the things I'd done. And I didn't mention that my father was a role model for that. He was definitely a role model for what not to do, but in many ways, he did have that nature connection because he was raised till he was 14 in Newfoundland, and he was the last person in our family heritage to be raised in that fishing culture, understanding the rhythms and the forms and the messages and what everything outside meant and how to interpret those things. And so I'd been raised witnessing him doing that without even realizing he was doing that, modeling that. He'd often be standing at the front door in the morning, just kind of smoking his cigarette, taking a drag and just standing there looking out. And he always just looked so peaceful in those moments. And that was rare. So I took note. And I would often get up and stand with him and I'd say, "What are you looking at, Dad?" And he'd say, "Well, what do you see out there?" And I'd be like, I don't know. And then he'd say, "What do you smell?" And I'd say, "I don't know." And he'd say, "Well, what do you hear?" And I'd be like, birds. And I don't even think he realized what he was doing, how much he was modeling, and that he was demonstrating that nature was a calming experience. But all those things I already had in me, and I just didn't understand them until I heard you kind of put it all together in the model that you had really been studying for I don't know how many years at that point. So your work came together with a lot of the work I'd been doing on child development and trying to understand neurology and behavior and all of those things. And so that was 21 years ago or something. And for the last 21 years, I've been really bringing those things together, not just in my work, but driving my family crazy because every free moment, I just can't get away from it. I'm studying it, I'm looking at it, I'm working with it, and I'm trying to clarify and simplify to be able to express to other people what that is. The fact that nature isn't an add-on or something, an after-school activity. It's who we are, it's what we are, and without it, we just can't become fully who we have the possibility to become.
So habilitation out of that story is referencing basically living in communication with the natural rhythm cycles and beings and elements around us that then creates a better version of ourselves in a sense, like or the version of ourselves we were born to be in some way. But it seems like it's not just about nature, it's also about how we communicate with each other. Right? Because in your story, you're talking about the nurturing you're getting from nature, but you're also talking about feeling limited in your sort of interpersonal stuff, right? Like how to be a communicator or whatever, and that you're still passionate about that because you want people to understand how these two worlds fit together to habilitate us, essentially, right? Like this is how we were meant to be, and I know, I've spent a lot of time with the San Bushmen, but what I see is, I always assumed that teenagers were just, teenagers. And then when they hit 13, 14, oh my God, right? How can I survive this? And their grumpiness and their intensity and all this kind of stuff. And I always kind of just thought that was the age until I got to the Kalahari. And then I started to witness that there was no change in the conduct, demeanor, and loving wholeness of these people from birth all the way into their 90s. Like you could not find that place where it was interrupted, and I see that as kind of a marker of, okay, well, these are the descendants of the collective ancestors of humanity, right? Like these are pretty much the descendants of all of our ancestors, and they're still right where they were 200,000 years ago, and they're still doing what they've done. So to be with them is to kind of be with, oh, this is what it looks like when people are fully integrated. All their senses, they're deeply connected to everything in nature, and they have the conduct of how to be good humans to one another, right? There's this intergenerational, as Darshan Narvais calls it, the evolved nest. There's alloparents, there's intergenerational caring and mentoring, so it's like you get to see that and be like, oh, that's what's possible, right? And I feel like you're building a bridge to that possibility for people. Kathleen is not just sitting here waxing with us philosophically. She's trained, I don't even know how many you've trained in occupational therapy and nature connection mentoring. You're always doing that. So Kathleen's not just doing this in her head. She's also then figuring out how to disperse it out so other people can make use of these tools, right? Am I accurate in saying that?
Yes, you are. Yeah, there's so much there in what you said. And to go back to the beginning of what you were saying, yes, the connection between human development and the natural world, it begins at birth, before birth, really. But really what clued me into diving deeper down that was, you've heard me tell the story about my older daughter when she was 5 months old. And obviously, by the dates that I shared earlier, I was a little caught off guard with finding out I was pregnant. I hadn't intended on being pregnant yet, but she was smarter than I was. And so for the first few months of her life, I was really having this existential crisis, where I knew I wasn't ready to be a mother. Who is ever ready to be a mother? But at that point, I knew enough to know that there was a lot I didn't know. And I didn't want to do it wrong. And I'm sure that most people can relate to that. And one day my father came over to visit, and, he was just doing his thing. And this is actually while I was pregnant, before I had had my daughter. And he came over and he was seeing all the books and all the things that I was reading about parenting and human development. And he just kind of spat out at me. He's like, "What the hell do you need all those books for, woman?" he goes, "Women have been doing this forever." And I was, about 7 months pregnant, and I was really emotional, and I was just so upset. And I like grabbed my jacket and I just mad walked out the door, and I just like waddled up the street, as far as I could go, and came to a park. And I was just sitting in this park, and I was witnessing like the maple, the maple helicopter seeds, maple trees, and the helicopter seeds all kind of just fly down from the trees. And I was just looking at this tree going, okay, so the trees don't need books, and they don't need to do all the research. They seem to know when to release their leaves and, and their seeds and how to grow and all this stuff. And I was kind of mad that my dad had a bit of a point. I was a little irritated by that, but that kind of got me thinking. And then when Veda was born, 5 months after she was born, I walked out the front door, and I was having a hard time as a mom. I just didn't find any books that really spoke to exactly what I was feeling. Like, there's the what to expect when you're expecting. I'm like, what about what to expect when you weren't expecting, Like, and also that thing that gives you full resonance that goes, this is what I'm looking for, and this makes total sense. And so I walked out the door. She was on my hip. She was about, like I said, about 5 months old. It was that first warm spring day. And it had been a cold winter. She'd been born in a snowstorm. And as we walked out the door, that first warm gust of like beautiful, delicious spring wind blew up, and it hit us both in the face. And when it did that, she like turned her little face into the wind, and she just gasped. She went over and over. And I started laughing. And when I started laughing, she like turned and looked at me. And of course I laughed again. And then she turned back to the wind and did it again. And this happened like 15 times, 10, 15 times in a row. Her turning to the wind, gasping, turning to me, seeing me laugh again, turning back to the wind. And in that moment, I knew there was something in that moment that was profoundly important, because it fully resonated. And I was like, there's the book I've been looking for. And so when I look back in retrospect, after all the learning I've done in the last, how old is she now? Goodness, 26 years. I realized that what that moment was what I call, what I've kind of started saying, ecoception. We have all these sensory systems, and there's one like that's been missing for me. Ecoception is like that instigator from nature. Like, nature wakes us up and asks us to engage and participate, to be in relationship, because the way we develop is through our senses. And so that breeze hitting her skin woke up her tactile sense and said, hey, pay attention to this. And when she looked to me, my response said, yeah, that's important. Let's pay attention to that. And so she turned to it again and paid attention to it. And so over and over, that wind gave her skin, her tactile sense, the ability to engage and develop. And all of our other senses operate in the same way. And nature offers us every opportunity we need to develop. So there's so much more there. but I'm going to pause for a minute and take a drink of water.
The thing that reflected to me in that story as well is the way in which those messages are sent, through play and connection and joy and fun. I heard something recently, and I don't know if this number is exactly accurate, but it's something like if we're working to memorize something and we sort of repeat it didactically, it can take, like up to 400 repetitions for it to fully be memorized. But if we do it through play, it can happen as quickly as 7 times.
Yeah.
Just the power of that, like that's 50 times greater. So that, I think that's a really beautiful message there too, is to look at that idea of playfulness and connection and joy and naturalness is not just something that feels nice for us in the moment. It's actually a key to being more effective as well. What are your
Right.
thoughts on
And,
that?
in the world of occupational therapy, we say that play is the work of childhood. Play is the occupation of childhood, or at least that's how our evolution designed us. Because like you said, there's an organization, I think, that came out with that reference that you're talking about, and it's all about research on play.
I was in the Kalahari with an exercise physiologist whose specialty is posture, right? And helping people get back into good posture to resolve. It seems related to occupational therapy in some way. And he was there. He's older than I am, Tom Kelleher from Spokane, Washington, and he was watching the Bushmen and he was fascinated. He turned to me and he said, John, look at this. Do you see what they're doing? I'm like, well, I'm not sure what you're referencing, Tom. He said, but look, the adults are playing right now. They're playing the game and they're making the children watch. And when the adults are tired from playing, they just drop the play equipment and they walk away and they don't even look back. And then the children come out and imitate. Mm-hmm. He said, I don't know about you, but when I grew up, the parents chased us outside to play and we had to go play. And they didn't model that for us. Mm-hmm. But here, this culture is backwards in that way, but maybe we're backwards, he said, because play, we give it up as kids and then we have to grow up. But they keep play going all the way. Look at the 90-year-old woman is in the game. She's playing, right? Everybody is playing. They don't stop playing. And I'm just like, whoa, that was making my ear get really big when you were just talking about that, because in occupational therapy, the occupation of childhood is play. And I think what I'm realizing is that, well, maybe we just keep that going throughout our whole lives too. Like we learn it in childhood, we master it in childhood, but we didn't just bring it on the journey, like whatever we do as adults playfully, we integrate quickly.
Yeah. And the modeling is huge. My father actually used to say, do as I say, not as I do. And I think a lot of our generation got some of that. And it's really quite the opposite. It doesn't matter how fine our words are, what we say, how we try to teach our children verbally. They're going to do what they witness us doing. That's just how we are designed, because that's how we got to be where we are, by watching the adults around us for cues in our environment on how to proceed, if this is safe or unsafe. And our brain developed its capacity by moving through, a landscape and determining that very quickly, and then developing a system based on not responding to the environment or reacting to the environment, but predicting the environment. And that's what our brains are designed to do, which is why tracking is such a valuable tool, or bird language is such a valuable, valuable tool to help children's brains develop, and also to get back on track to development, because it really engages those ancient, not even ancient, I mean, a couple hundred years ago, a fraction of an eyelash of a blink of time. And they're powerful. I have so many powerful stories about children and tracking and bird language, that's the thing that shifted everything for them and allowed them to begin to either learn or heal or calm their regulatory systems. So many things.
Why?
Good question. Because Those activities are ancestral activities. Those activities helped us evolve, right? So that we've been practicing creating brain patterns for a million years, depending on what scientist you want to talk to. And our brains, when we put our activity back in line with what our brains are designed to do, then there's an efficiency that happens. It's like those helicopter seeds on the maple tree. I was like, why do they know what to do? They don't think about it. They just do it. It puts us back in that historical context of how we developed. And it helps us to engage with the world through our senses and forget about all that nonsense that's happening in our brain and just be and become with nature.
So Tom Brown likes to call that the birthright. We were all born with a package of nervous system tissue that really wants to go a certain way. And when we design with natural cycles, essentially, right? When, like your dad with the wind and watching and the listening, when we attune to the natural cycles, when we attune to the natural beings, we're activating that birthright. And then I know you know a thing or two about sensory integration, as you said earlier. That's kind of your specialty. When we're teaching, the 8 Shields model, one of the layers we teach is the layer of the senses, right? And for the longest time, we had the eyes in the east because the first thing we run into is the hazards, and we have to use our eyes to look for them, right? As you said, to predict, right? Am I safe? Am I not safe? And then when we get to that mid-morning 9 a.m. shield, we talk about imitation, because kids are so kinesthetic. They're so in their body, they're just full of vitality and energy. Their little bodies can't sit still when they're excited, right? So I've noticed that the Bushmen are all about imitation. And you were the one who introduced me to the terms proprioception and vestibular, which then I'm like, oh, that explains that Southeast thing, right? And especially with your story about kids bouncing on the couch.
Right. Parents still ask me all the time, why do they do this? I tell them, stop jumping on the couch, and they keep jumping on the couch, even though they get in trouble. Why? And I'm like, well, that's because they need to develop their proprioceptive and vestibulars. That their bodies are designed to do that. And if they don't get that in a natural way, in a natural environment, they're still going to seek that information from the environment out, because they have to develop it to reach any semblance of potential.
Right. So that's an important part of the sensory integration journey. Like, they need that to happen, and then to integrate with sight, and then integrate with what we put in the midday, which is hearing, because right when you're tempted to look at animal tracks and get focus locked, you also have to listen at the same time. So you're learning to multitask your awareness, which brings you into the quiet mind, essentially, right? Which is as you were saying, that really helps with regulation. And then they develop that tactile sense, and they develop the sense of smell, and they start to learn interoception. They start to pay attention to what's going on within them. I'm kind of going around the wheel fast. And then the sense of taste we put in the midnight, because it relates to survival and the communication we get from our food. And then that final one, which is, in the Northern Hemisphere, we call the Northeast, is what we call the storyteller's mind, where we bring all the senses together in the reliving of experiences that we had in the day. And like your dad did with you, when the door was open and he was standing there on the porch, what do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? Right? Like, that's a really cool instinct that he had that, and he knew to do that. We'll speak to that a little bit, that the journey of sensory integration and how that ties to, say, bird language or tracking or nature connection in general.
Well, I look at the wheel a little bit differently than you do as the senses. And I know we've had that discussion before, but I think it's probably time we have it again. Because, I place the senses a little bit differently than you do. I'm looking at them through the lens of human development and the life cycle and the day cycle of a human in relationship to the natural cycles. And so for me, interoception is in the north. And that's because when we get to the north, essentially in an ideal world, we're in that enlightened, integrated, connected human who is taking all of our sensory information in. And that moment of interoception is when your gut is talking to your brain, giving you that gut sense, or some people call it intuition. And that's when you can be walking through a landscape and not even have to turn your head and know that there's something there. It's ecological wisdom and it's full connection. And so that's really what interoception is that ability to. So I like to say that we have all these senses that we come with. Depending on what scientists you talk to, there might be hundreds. But for the purposes of human development, we talk about essentially 8 for the conversation. So we have these 8 senses, and you can look at them like they're each a musical instrument. There's a beautiful violin sitting in front of you, your sense of sight, for example. But your sense of sight isn't going to do anything until you pick that musical instrument up and you play it. And you play it over and over and over again. And that's how our senses are. So we can imagine that our senses are all these beautiful instruments and we're playing them. But we're not supposed to play them as individual instruments. They're supposed to be part of an orchestra, playing together to make beautiful music together. And so that's the thing that most people are missing. We are meant to develop in concert with all the senses firing and wiring at the same time to make sense of information, sound information, sight information, movement information, all these things. So to give you an example of a story of when our senses are working integrated versus not integrated, when they're not integrated, it's essentially a misfiring in prediction. And that could be because the sound information, the sight information, the body feeling information are not lining up together. So that I know I've told you about the time that I had a mountain lion stuck in our chicken coop and what happened with that, and how my senses had a misfiring or a misalignment, because I was sitting where I am now in this tree house, and it was a Sunday afternoon about noon. I was the only one on the farm, and I heard the birds around me kind of going off, some alarming. And so I was kind of tuning it out because I was really involved with the work I was doing on the computer and tuning it out, but I'm also kind of hearing it. And then it's moving towards the chicken coop. And all of a sudden I hear the chicken coop go off. Everyone's freaking out in the chicken coop. And I drop what I'm doing. I'm like, oh my gosh. And we had a fox who hung around the house all the time. So I'm like, the fox is in the chicken coop. And I drop what I'm doing and I run out and I start running towards the chicken coop. And it's not very far. It's, 100 feet or so from where I stop in my tracks, because I see not a fox, but I see a mountain lion leap up and slam itself into the side of the chicken coop because it had gotten stuck in there and it was trying to find a way out. And I'm like shaking. I don't have my phone. I'm like backing away, because at that point I couldn't see if it was still in the chicken coop because we had some brush. And so I was standing there thinking, okay, is it there? Did it get out? Where is it? And then I saw it move. So I backed up to the house. But what had gone on there was what I heard, what I felt, and what I saw didn't line up. I had a prediction error. My favorite neuroscientist, Lisa Feldman Barrett, that's what she would say. It's a prediction error. And so that was a lack of sensory integration. So I kind of reorganized my senses. So all those things matched up. And now when the mountain lion's around, I can usually sense that the mountain lion is here and there is something different and my body knows it. So that I've kind of corrected that prediction error. And now I have integration when that experience is happening.
That's really cool. I mean, I would call that, like in the way when I talk about working with people who are learning bird language, I call it calibration, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Because in the beginning, you're sort of making sense of the sound and the motion, right? But the cool thing about bird language is that the sound and the motion matches. And then it also matches interoception, which I love. It's like, I know it's a bobcat. I can't tell you how I know, but I know it's a bobcat, right?
Because you've just integrated it. So our brain just wants the quickest route to information because it's less metabolically expensive. So when it can make a shortcut anytime, it's going to do that. And that's what that is. You don't have to think, oh, this is a bobcat. You just feel it and you know it. That's integration. That's interoception.
So, and as far as what you were saying earlier about the way you use the wheel of the senses versus the way I do, we were talking to Kira Hinksman from Ireland yesterday from the Forest School movement there. And she was saying, well, on your wheel, everything starts in the East, but in Ireland, it starts in the West. It actually starts with Halloween because that's the culture they're working with. And Aidan and I and Sarah, we keep telling people, well, no, there's not one right way to do this, right? There's the context in which you're working with it, that you're evolving a culture that meets the needs of your approach, right? And for me, just having a wheel of senses is all I need, right? I just want there to be a wheel of senses so people can make sure they're working all of them, right? Because you can't just work one and not the others, right? That's the whole purpose of it. But ultimately, like you said, we want to bring all the senses together, all of them, and everything that we're doing, because that's what's going to really activate that birthright energy, that that habilitation thing that you've been talking about. I have a question, but I want to give it to Aidan for a moment because I can feel him thinking about something right now.
I would love for you to tell us what the 8 senses are that you like to describe for the purposes of the conversation, right? Because I'm sitting here going, oh man, all right, interoception, proprioception, and
so sight, hearing, smell, taste, vestibular, which is movement, then proprioception, which is how you feel your body through your muscles and your joints. So if you jump off a log and land, the feeling and the information that goes through your joints at that moment and your muscles to your brain, that's your proprioception system. And then there's interoception, tactile, our sense of touch. And then I like to talk about, like I said, I've kind of started using the term ecoception, that instigating invitation from nature for us to engage and to start to develop ourselves. So those are the senses. And the thing is, we come wired passively. So we're wired, but then again, we have to pick up that instrument and do something with it in order to develop. Development it's not a guarantee. It's an active process.
The importance of what Tom Brown, mentor, grandfather, said, the 2 halves of the wheel, right? You have to have both halves in equal measure. Like I go out and have an experience through my senses. That's the lower half. And then the upper half is when you come back and tell your grandmother, and then she helps to pull out all the senses like your dad did that day, right? In the storytelling. And then she sends you off for another errand, and then off you go for another experience, and you come back. And so that development, that integration. So a lot of people in our modern times complain that there is no grandmother to catch my story. So what do I do about that? I can't find one in the phone book who knows how to do the sensory integration story catching. So, what do you advise people when you're talking about that? Because I know the importance of those 2 halves.
Yeah, and that's the same thing as the dance between my 5-month-old and the wind and myself. That's what you're talking about. That's the engagement, and then the return to mom. And is this important? And mom says yes or no. And then we either re-engage or just discard that information because the brain wants efficiency. That's our survival bias. So what I tell people is, I work with a lot of families. So I support the parent and the child relationship in understanding that piece. I think when you and I started talking, we were both much younger. And, we would say things and then people would reflect to us, hey, don't say that. And we'd be like, oh, you're right. That's right. I need to kind of re-up that or recalibrate those things. And, I think you and I were both guilty of saying back in the day, oh, just send the kids outside to play. And then there's a piece that's missing because people would forget about the other piece you're talking about. It's that connection. That's the moment of connection. And that's where the integration happens between that wind touching my daughter's skin, her turning to me saying in some way, yes, this is important. Let's do this together. And her turning back to the wind. And then, so that's the integrative moment, is where it makes sense to her that this is a delightful experience as opposed to when it's that moment of connection, when the child comes in and says, I just saw, this bird that I always see, and it was doing something different. And instead of saying, oh, that's cool, we say, what was it doing? It's just literally a slight shift in how we connect with each other. So I just tell parents, it's in those daily moments. You don't have to go outward bound or even enroll in an after school thing. Although I encourage everyone to do those things because they really bring us back to the essence and the value and the shared social experience. But it can be in those little everyday moments where a child says something. In the Harvard Center for the Developing Child would call that moment a serve and return moment. And it's how our brains are structured in a healthy way. When we have lots of serve and returns, the wind serves, the child serves, somebody responds. And hopefully a lot of those responses in nature are what I call nature positive. And that's the moment right there, that shared moment. Because, a lot of people, we haven't talked about regulation. So this is a huge term. So people are always talking about self-regulation. We need to calm ourselves down. We need to get ourselves excited. We need to know when to engage, when to be quiet, stop interrupting, all those regulation things. There's no such thing as self-regulation. We regulate in relationship to everything else. And so I call it relational regulation. Some people use the term co-regulation. I don't even think that really fully explains it. It's really relational. The scientist I referred to earlier, she likes to say, the best thing for our regulation is another person. And the worst thing for our regulation is another person.
Exactly.
Yeah. So keeping that in mind and connecting in those little brief moments, I've told parents for years that 5 minutes up front will buy you hours on the back end. So just take a deep breath in that moment of frustration. Take a deep breath. Present yourself in a way that your child knows you are there with them, presence, and just check in, see what's going on. Ask them, if they're upset, ask them about the bird in the sky. That will kind of bring you together. And that's where one of my favorite terms that I've ever heard is one that you introduced me to called story catching. And I use that all the time. And people say, what's that? And it's exactly that. It's taking a moment to hear each other's stories, even if it's just a sentence. Today, I saw an eagle when I was driving. Oh, where were you driving? That just shows some interest. Is that, did I answer your question?
What was that eagle doing besides flying? Which way was it going?
Mm-hmm.
Was it hunting or was it relaxed? Like all of those kinds of questions that we could ask, right? Just from our own curiosity, in a sense, right?
Yeah, which is what we're designed to do.
That's beautiful. All right. Well, here's a question for you as we wrap up here. You do a lot of things. Like if someone visits KathleenLockyer.com, you're going to be like, wow, Kathleen does a lot of things. Who do you do them for? How do you do them? I know you have gone to many places where people have learned art of mentoring and are doing nature connection programs, and you've gone in there to help them up their game. So what are the kinds of things you do to help people work with this stuff and to kind of realize, what they're actually working with?
Yeah, thanks for asking, John. Well, the first thing I'm doing right now, the foremost thing I'm doing right now is finishing up a book where I discuss all these things and share a little bit more about my story and that chaos and how I came to understand it. I adore my parents, and I'm grateful for my childhood in all the messiness that it was. So I tell some of that story, and this book is primarily to help people do exactly what I feel like I've done, maybe make it a little easier for them, understand that it's okay. We may have had adversities. In fact, that can be really positive for us, and how to bring that forward in a positive way in your life and to do it through nature connection and so much more. So that's one thing I'm doing. I also do some online courses and in-person courses. A lot of people are looking for support in understanding how to work with different behaviors, because we do know that childhood behaviors have gotten more challenging. There's a lack of development happening, developmental deprivation happening right now because of the world we live in, how we live now. And so to support kids and their families and mentors in the best ways and the most supportive ways for both the child and the mentor, to work with the behaviors and to help habilitate those kids and give them behaviors that will be more skillful in the world. So I do both an online course for neurodiversity in the outdoors and an in-person workshop. I also, right now, I have students working on their capstone projects for their doctoral degrees in occupational therapy. And so we are looking at what's called a tier 2 intervention in public schools, which is I'm so excited about, because so there's interventions in school when a child is identified as struggling either academically or behaviorally. They go through a process. And at first it's, let's look at this child without any real interventions. And how does this look? The next thing is, yes, they need extra support. So that's a tier 1 intervention. And then when that doesn't work, then they go into a tier 2 intervention, which is where there's a team of people and they might pull them out in a group and give them additional support. And if that doesn't work, then they're sent to me, occupational therapy. And we then kind of troubleshoot and figure out what's going to support this child. So tier 2, there's a lot of kids in tier 2. And usually they're just like social groups in school, but we are implementing a nature connection in the 8 Shields fashion. We were able to get a 1-hour time slot once a week with a group of 11 kids to demonstrate that this intervention will be more powerful than any other intervention that they're doing, because we'd like for this to be available to all kids in public school. How amazing is that, right? I'm going to shout out to Claire from University of Wisconsin. She's doing that project. And then we're also working with Aldo Leopold Nature Center in Madison, Wisconsin. I have another student we're doing essentially a parent intervention where we're doing a little online workshop, just a 10 to 15 minute video each week, giving them a little bit of understanding about nature connection, because their kids are enrolled with a nature connection program at Aldo Leopold Nature Center. These are early childhood kids. And so the parents are learning online concurrently while their children are experiencing.
Brilliant.
And so our goal there is to help parents generalize what the kids are doing at the program to home, so that the parents can decrease their own stress and overwhelm of thinking that they're not giving their child enough, or they have to go out and do all these other things. They can literally walk outside their door and know that they're doing the best thing for their child by just being present with them in nature. So those are really exciting things. Yeah. And then I work privately with parents and kind of do some parent coaching to support them and their children when they're struggling to know, am I doing the right thing? Or what do I do? My child's doing this. Is this right? Is this right? All those crazy questions that come up for us as parents. I've not only got the professional experience and understanding, but the personal experience, because I've raised 2 daughters who were very spirited, as you remember.
Yes,
John, I was just telling someone the other day how when my older daughter, she was kind of having a meltdown. She was around 7, I think, when this was happening. And you just kind of look to me and you go, she's going to need a really good grandmother. So I'm like that. I'm like a really good grandmother. That's what I do. And so I support parents in that. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Gosh, thank you so much for sharing everything, Kathleen, and thanks for being here with us. This is just a delight.
It's my pleasure, Aidan. I feel like you guys, you've been part of our lives for so long. Veda and Kira still say Uncle John, and they know you as family, and also Jon and I, you've done a lot of professional things together, and I think there was something I just want to wrap up by saying. You brought forward all that people are doing different things with the 8 Shields model, and that the senses you put on the wheel one way and I put them on the wheel a different way. And I think that's something that I've always appreciated, even though you and I sometimes maybe, everyone is always learning. And I think that that's something that I experience with you as well. We're always learning. And the amazing thing about the 8 Shields model is you can take it and implement it in any setting, in anything you're doing, whether it's just your daily life as a parent and you're with your children, or in a nonprofit, organization. And you can modify it to make it work for that setting. And what I've done with it a lot is modify it or change it, or kind of like look at it and say, well, maybe this doesn't work for me, but I'm going to do it this way. And you're always interested in that conversation. So you're always updating. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So I just thank you for that, and for sharing so much with so many people. And that's a hard thing to do in life. It's a beautiful and juicy thing, but that juiciness is like beautiful, delicious, and messy all at the same time. And so I'm just grateful that you keep doing it, and I keep doing it as well. I'm going to keep doing it.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Kathleen and Aidan. It's been a really fun conversation. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Until next time. Thanks for listening to Tracking Connections. You can find everything related to the podcast and our current offerings at trackingconnections.net. We'll see you next time.